The day my son, David, told me I had to leave my own house, the home I worked 30 long years to pay off, was the day I realized I had raised a stranger. I spent my entire life saving every penny from my modest salary to pay off that $400,000 mortgage, only to have him and his wife, Tiffany, treat me like an inconvenience in my own living room. They wanted my space for a high-tech gaming suite, and they used a moment of my physical weakness to trick me into signing away my life's work. My heart was heavy, and my world felt like it was collapsing. But David and Tiffany made one massive mistake. They were so blinded by their own greed that they forgot to check the land deeds my father left behind. Before I share the shocking way I reclaimed my dignity and left them facing the consequences of their own choices, I would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment and let me know which beautiful city or state you are watching from today. It truly warms my heart to see our community connecting from all over the country. Also, a quick note for my dear friends watching. While this story is a fictional narrative created for your entertainment, the message of respect and the lessons it teaches are very real and deeply important. I remember the smell of the library most of all. It was a mixture of old paper, floor wax, and the quiet dreams of 1,000 authors. For 30 long years, that building was my second home. I worked as a head librarian in our small town, a job that didn't come with a fancy title or a massive paycheck, but it gave me something better. It gave me a sense of purpose. I saw children grow up to become parents, and then grandparents, all while I sat behind that mahogany desk, stamping books and guiding people toward the knowledge they sought. I was never a woman who needed much. I lived a life of quiet frugality. While my friends were taking expensive cruises to the Caribbean or buying the latest luxury cars, I was packing a brown bag lunch every single day. I drove the same silver sedan for 15 years until the floorboards rusted through. Every spare penny I earned went toward one single solitary goal. I wanted to own my home. I wanted to know that no matter what happened in this world, I had a roof over my head that no one could take away. That house was a beautiful 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch. It sat on a quiet acre of land that my father had left to me. When I first took out the mortgage, the numbers felt like a mountain I would never finish climbing. $400,000. To a librarian, $400,000 felt like 400 million. I remember looking at that first bank statement and feeling a knot in my stomach. But I told myself, step by step, month by month, I would get there. I spent my weekends painting the shutters and tending to the garden, instead of hiring contractors. I learned how to fix a leaky faucet and how to patch the drywall. Each repair was a labor of love. I wasn't just maintaining a building. I was nurturing my sanctuary. There were nights when I was so tired my bones ached. But then I would sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea and look out at the oak trees. I would tell myself that this was all for my future. This was for my peace of mind. Then, 5 years ago, the day finally came. I walked into the local branch of the bank with a check in my hand. It was the final payment. I remember the teller, a young woman who looked no older than my son, smiling at me as she processed the papers. When she handed me the receipt and told me my mortgage was paid in full, I walked out to my car and cried. I sat in the driver's seat and just breathed. $400,000 paid. Every cent of it was earned through honest, hard work. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in my life, I truly owned the ground I stood on. I felt a sense of security that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived through it. I thought my struggles were over. I thought the rest of my days would be spent reading in my sunroom and enjoying the fruits of my 30 years of labor. I was so proud of what I had built. But as I sat there, looking at my beautiful home, I never could have imagined that the greatest threat to my peace wouldn't come from the bank or the economy. It would come from my own flesh and blood. The silence of a house that is finally paid off is a special kind of music. For a few months after that final bank payment, I just sat in the stillness. I would walk from room to room, feeling the polished wood of the banisters and looking at the way the afternoon sun hit the curtains. It was my sanctuary. It was my reward for 30 years of labor at the library. I thought I would grow old in this silence, surrounded by my books and my memories. But then, the phone rang. It was my son, David. David was always a boy who seemed to be looking for the next big thing. He had a good heart, or at least, I believed he did back then. He had married Tiffany 3 years prior. Tiffany was a woman who always seemed a bit too focused on her appearance and her social media, but I told myself that was just how the younger generation lived. When David called me that evening, his voice sounded heavy, burdened, almost desperate. He told me that their rent in the city had spiked to nearly $3,000 a month. He talked about how they were drowning in debt and how they would never be able to afford a home of their own if something didn't change. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "We were wondering, just for a little while, if we could move into the extra rooms. We want to save every penny. We want to build a future, but we can't do it while we are paying someone else's mortgage." As a mother, what was I supposed to say? My heart went out to him immediately. I remembered how hard it was when I was young, scraping together nickels to buy milk. I thought about the 3 empty bedrooms upstairs that were doing nothing but gathering dust. I thought about the joy of having family back in the house. I imagined Sunday dinners with the smell of roast beef filling the hallways. I imagined the sound of laughter echoing off the walls. I thought, perhaps, this was God's way of making sure I wasn't lonely in my retirement. "Of course, David," I told him. "The door is always open for you. This is your home too." I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I scrubbed the floors until they shone like glass. I bought new linens for the beds, making sure they were soft and welcoming. I cleared out the closets, moving my own sentimental boxes into the basement to make room for their lives. I was so excited. I felt like a young mother again, nesting and preparing for her children to return. I even baked a fresh apple pie the morning they were set to arrive. I wanted the house to smell like love. When the moving truck pulled into the driveway, I was standing on the porch with a wide smile. David looked exhausted, but Tiffany looked around the property with an expression I didn't quite understand at the time. It wasn't gratitude. It was more like she was appraising a piece of jewelry. She didn't say thank you for the pie. She just asked if the internet speed was high enough for her online projects. I told her we could upgrade it if she needed. I wanted her to be happy. I wanted them both to feel at home. The first few months were wonderful. Or so I convinced myself. The house was loud again. There were boxes everywhere, and the kitchen was constantly in use. I found myself cooking for 3 instead of 1, and I didn't mind the extra work. I enjoyed the company. I enjoyed seeing David every morning before he went to his job at the logistics firm. We would sit at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about the old days. I felt like I was helping him. I felt like I was being a good mother. But slowly, very slowly, the boundaries began to blur. It started with the small things. Tiffany didn't like the way I organized the pantry, so she moved everything. She said my old wooden spoons were unsanitary, so she threw them away and replaced them with bright plastic ones. I felt a pinch in my heart. Those spoons had belonged to my mother, but I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to cause friction. I told myself that it was a small price to pay for having my family under my roof. Then came the financial part. They were supposed to be saving money for their own house. That was the agreement. But I noticed that every day, there were new packages on the porch. Amazon boxes piled up like a mountain. High-end clothes, expensive skincare products for Tiffany, and new gadgets for David. I began to wonder how much they were actually saving. One night, I gently brought it up at dinner. I mentioned that the utility bills had tripled since they moved in. I asked if they could contribute just a little bit toward the electricity. David looked at his plate, but Tiffany looked me right in the eye. "We are in a transition phase, Martha," she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. "If we start paying you rent or utilities, we will never get out of here. We thought you wanted us to succeed. Don't you want your son to have a future?" I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Of course, I wanted them to succeed. I felt like a selfish old woman for even asking. So, I apologized. I told them I would handle the bills. I started dipping into my modest savings, the money I had set aside for my own medical expenses and travel. I told myself it was an investment in my son. I believed that my kindness was a bridge that would lead them to a better life. I didn't realize that I wasn't building a bridge. I was building a pedestal for them to look down on me from. By the end of that first year, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I was a guest in a hotel that I was paying for. Tiffany had taken over the living room with her photography equipment. David was always tired and irritable. The laughter I had imagined had turned into a series of short, tense conversations. But still, I held on. I loved my son. I believed in the sanctity of family. I believed that if I just gave a little more, if I was just a little more patient, they would eventually see how much I was sacrificing for them. I was blinded by my own love, and I couldn't see the storm that was gathering just outside my door. I was the one who had invited the wolf into the fold, and I was still busy making sure the wolf was fed and warm. 2 years. That is how long it took for the mask to completely fall away. For 730 days I had played the role of the quiet, supportive mother. I had retreated into the corners of my own home, trying to stay out of the way while David and Tiffany built their empire. That is what Tiffany called it. She had stopped looking for a traditional job and decided she was going to be an influencer and a professional gamer. I didn't really understand what that meant, but I saw the thousands of dollars they spent on neon lights, expensive microphones, and humming computer towers. The house was no longer a place of peace. It was filled with the sound of Tiffany shouting at a computer screen at 3 o'clock in the morning. I would lie in my bed, the bed I had slept in for decades, and listen to her screaming at people over the internet. The bass from her music would vibrate through the walls, making my heart race. When I tried to ask her to keep it down, she would just roll her eyes and tell me that I was stifling her brand. David had changed too. He looked older, grimmer. He didn't talk to me about the old days anymore. He only talked about the pressure he was under. He seemed to view me not as a mother but as a problem that needed to be managed. The tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every meal was eaten in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware. Then came that Tuesday evening in November. I had spent the afternoon raking leaves in the yard, trying to keep the property looking nice. My back was aching, and my knees were stiff from the cold air. I had made a simple pot of chicken soup, hoping that a warm meal might soften the mood. We sat down at the mahogany dining table, the table where David had done his homework as a boy, the table where I had celebrated so many birthdays. David cleared his throat. He wouldn't look at me. He kept staring at a spot on the wall just above my head. "Mom," he started, his voice flat and rehearsed. "We've been looking at the numbers. Tiffany's streaming career is at a tipping point. She has thousands of followers now, but her current setup in the guest room is too small. The acoustics are bad, and she doesn't have enough room for her green screen and her secondary consoles." I took a sip of my soup, feeling a cold dread begin to pool in my stomach. "Well," I said softly, "maybe we could rearrange the basement? We could finish the walls and make it very nice for her." Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "The basement? Martha, it's damp. Pee. And it smells like mildew. I can't film my content in a dungeon. My viewers expect a certain level of quality." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "We've already decided. We need the master bedroom. It's the largest room in the house. It has the best natural light and the walk-in closet that we can convert into a sound booth." I felt the air leave my lungs. "The master bedroom? But David, that's my room. Your father and I lived in that room for 30 years. All my things are there. My vanity, my books, my memories. Where am I supposed to go?" David finally looked at me, but there was no warmth in his eyes. There was only a cold, calculated distance. "We think it would be better if you moved into that studio apartment downtown. You know, the one near the library? It's much smaller and easier for you to clean. You're getting older, Mom. You shouldn't be climbing these stairs anyway. It's a smart business move for us, and it's a lifestyle move for you." I felt a sting of tears in my eyes. "A business move? David, this is my home. I worked my whole life to pay for this roof. I invited you in because you said you were struggling. Now you are telling me to leave my own bedroom so Tiffany can play games on the internet? It's not just games. Tiffany snapped, slamming her hand on the table. The soup in my bowl rippled. It's a career. I'm making more money in a week than you made in a month at that dusty library. You're being selfish, Martha. You're sitting on a resource that we need. You're an inconvenience. You're just in the way. The word inconvenience hit me like a physical blow. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell his wife that she couldn't speak to his mother that way. But David just nodded in agreement. She's right, Mom, he said. The house is too big for you now. You're just rattling around in here. We need the space to grow. We're the ones with a future. You're just living in the past. I sat there, frozen. I looked at the table, the walls, and the portraits of our family hanging in the hallway. I realized in that moment that I wasn't a mother to them. I was a tenant who had outlived her usefulness. I was a hurdle they wanted to jump over. I won't do it, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I won't leave my room. And I won't leave my house. Tiffany didn't get angry this time. Instead, she smiled. It was a slow, cruel smile that made my skin crawl. She looked at David and gave him a small nod. Actually, Martha, David said, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. You don't really have a choice. Do you remember those papers we had you sign last year? The ones right after your cataract surgery? You were so groggy from the anesthesia. You said you trusted us to handle the medical power of attorney. My heart stopped. I remembered that day. My vision had been a blur, and my head had been spinning. David had brought a stack of papers to my bedside. He told me it was just to make sure he could talk to the doctors if something went wrong. I had signed them without a second thought. I had signed them because I loved him. Those weren't just medical papers, Mom, David said, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of shame in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was a quitclaim deed. You signed the house over to me as a gift. The title is in my name now. Legally, this is my house. And as the owner, I'm asking you to leave. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I couldn't breathe. The son I had carried, the son I had sacrificed everything for, had used my own failing eyes to rob me. He had stood by my hospital bed and stolen the only thing I had left. You stole it, I whispered, the words feeling like glass in my throat. You stole my home. It's not stealing if you signed the paper, Tiffany interjected, standing up and smoothing her hair. It's called a strategic transfer of assets. We've already called the locksmith. They'll be here on Monday to change the codes. You have 2 weeks to get your things out. We've already booked a moving van for your furniture. They got up from the table, leaving their half-eaten bowls of soup. They walked out of the room, talking to each other about what color of acoustic foam they should buy for the walls. I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of my life. I looked at my hands, the hands that had worked 30 years to pay for this room. They were shaking. I was 67 years old, and I had just been evicted by my own heart. I thought it was the end of my story. I thought I was going to disappear into a tiny studio apartment and wait to die, forgotten and betrayed. But as I sat there, the shock began to turn into something else. A small, cold spark of memory began to flicker in the back of my mind. I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to talk about the land. The house is just a box, Martha, he used to say. But the land. The land is the foundation. David and Tiffany thought they had won. They thought they had taken everything. But they were young, and they were arrogant. And in their rush to steal the roof over my head, they had forgotten to look at what was beneath their feet. The air in the dining room felt like it had turned to ice. I sat there, staring at my son, David, and his wife, Tiffany. The words they had just spoken, the words about the deed and the house, they didn't feel real. They felt like a nightmare that I was waiting to wake up from. But the clock on the wall kept ticking. The hum of the refrigerator stayed steady. This was not a dream. This was my life. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. I tried to clasp them together to make them stop, but I couldn't. My mind kept racing back to that day at the surgical center. It was only 1 year ago. I remember the smell of the antiseptic. I remember the bright fluorescent lights of the recovery room. I had just come out of surgery to remove cataracts from both of my eyes. Everything was a blur. The world looked like it was underwater. I was groggy from the anesthesia. My head felt heavy. And I was struggling just to keep my eyes open. David had been there. He had been so attentive. He had brought me a cup of water and a warm blanket. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such a devoted son. He had sat by my bedside and told me that the doctors needed a few more signatures. He said it was just for the medical power of attorney. He said it was to make sure he could take care of me if my recovery took longer than expected. "Just sign here, Mom," he had whispered. He held the clipboard for me. He placed the pen in my hand. I couldn't see the words on the page. I couldn't even see the lines where I was supposed to sign. I just trusted him. I loved him. I thought he was my protector. I didn't know that in that moment, in my most vulnerable state, my own son was handing me a pen to sign away my life. Tiffany stood up from the table. She began to clear her plate, her movements sharp and efficient. She looked at me with a cold, triumphant expression. "You really shouldn't be so surprised, Martha," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any empathy. "We told you we needed to grow. We told you that we had a vision for this property. You were just an obstacle. David did what he had to do to ensure our future." I looked at David. I wanted him to say something. I wanted him to tell me it was a mistake. But he just sat there, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He looked small. He looked cowardly. "David," I said, my voice cracking, "I gave you everything. I worked for 30 years at that library. I saved every dollar so you would have a home to come back to. How could you do this? How could you stand by my bed and lie to me?" "I didn't lie, Mom," he muttered, still looking at his lap. I realized that the house was better off in my name. "You're getting older. You're forgetful. What if you had an accident? What if the state took the house to pay for a nursing home?" I was protecting our inheritance. The word inheritance felt like a slap in the face. I wasn't even gone yet, and they were already carving up my life like vultures. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an account balance. They saw me as a square footage requirement. "I own the land, David," I said, a sudden spark of defiance lighting up in my chest. "My father left me this acre. He was a cautious man. He deeded the house and the land separately. You might have the titles to the building, but you don't own the ground it sits on." Tiffany stopped at the kitchen door. She turned around, a mocking laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, Martha, still clinging to those old stories? We've seen the papers. David owns the property. Our lawyer made sure of it. You're just confused. It's probably the age. That's why that studio apartment is going to be so much better for you. No stairs to worry about. No big lawns to maintain. Just a simple, quiet life for a simple, quiet woman." I realized then that they hadn't actually checked the old land deeds. They had looked at the house title and the primary lot description, but they hadn't gone back to the original filings from the 1950s. They were so arrogant, so sure of their own brilliance, that they hadn't done the deep research. My father had been a land surveyor. He knew things that modern lawyers often overlooked. He had divided the access road and the well site into a separate, private easement that stayed with the bloodline of the landholder. But I didn't tell them that. Not yet. I let the silence hang in the air. I let them believe they had won. I watched as they walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my cold soup and my shattered heart. I sat there for hours, watching the shadows grow long across the floor. I was a stranger in my own home, the colonial house I had spent 30 years maintaining. The garden I had planted with my own hands, the porch where I had hoped to spend my golden years. It was all gone. I was being evicted by the person I had brought into this world. The pain of that betrayal was deeper than any physical wound. It was a dull, constant ache in my soul. But as the night went on, the sadness began to transform. It turned into a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't just a librarian. I was a woman who had survived 30 years of budget cuts, difficult patrons, and a changing world. I was a woman who knew how to find information. I was a woman who knew how to wait. David and Tiffany wanted my room. They wanted their high-tech gaming suite. They wanted their neon lights and their digital followers. They thought they had taken everything from me. But they had forgotten one very important lesson. A house is just a structure. It's a pile of wood and shingles. Without the land, without the road, without the water. It's just a hollow box. I stood up and began to walk toward my bedroom. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was sharp. I would give them their 2 weeks. I would pack my boxes. I would move into that studio apartment. I would let them spend their money. I would let them build their empire. And then, when they were at their most confident, I would remind them whose daughter I was. I would remind them that in this world, you reap exactly what you sow. The moving day was the hardest day of my life. David and Tiffany hadn't even helped me pack. They had hired a cheap moving crew. 3 young men who didn't care about my memories. I watched as they tossed my boxes of books into the back of a dusty truck. I saw them handle my grandmother's china with no more care than if it were a stack of plastic plates. David stayed in the kitchen the whole time, staring at his laptop. Tiffany was already in my old bedroom, measuring the walls for her acoustic foam and her LED strips. She was humming a song. She sounded happy. She was happy that I was leaving. I walked through the house one last time. I touched the doorframe of the nursery where David had slept as a baby. I stood in the sunroom where my husband and I used to have our morning coffee before he passed away. Each room held 1,000 stories. Each floorboard had a memory attached to it. And now, I was being cut out of my own history. The studio apartment they had found for me was in a run-down part of the city. It was on the 4th floor of a brick building that smelled like old cooking oil and damp carpets. The elevator didn't work, so I had to watch the movers struggle up the stairs with my few remaining pieces of furniture. When the door finally closed and the movers were gone, I stood in the middle of the room. It was tiny. It was less than 500 square feet. The walls were a dull, yellowish white. The window looked out over a grey alleyway filled with overflowing trash bins. There was no garden. There were no oak trees. There was only the constant sound of sirens and the hum of a busy street. I tried to unpack my things, but there was nowhere for them to go. My dining table wouldn't fit. My favorite bookshelf had to stay in the hallway. I realized then that I had to let go of almost everything I owned. 30 years of collecting books, photographs, and mementos. And now I was living out of a few cardboard boxes. That first night was the loneliest night I have ever known. I sat on my bed, the only piece of furniture that fit comfortably in the room, and listened to the sounds of the building. I could hear a television blaring in the next apartment. I could hear people arguing in the hallway. I could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the window frame. I thought about David and Tiffany. I imagined them in my house. I imagined them sitting in my living room, laughing about how easy it had been to get rid of me. I felt a surge of bitterness so strong it made me feel sick. I had spent 30 years of my life making sure David was safe. I had gone without new clothes so he could have the best sneakers. I had worked overtime so he could go to summer camp. And this was my reward. A studio apartment and a view of a dumpster. My pension was small. After paying the $1,200 a month for rent and the rising costs of groceries, I had almost nothing left. I had to count every penny just like I did when I was a young mother. But this time, it felt different. There was no hope at the end of this struggle. Or so it seemed. I spent my days sitting in the local library. Not as a worker, but as a patron. It was the only place where I felt at home. I would sit in the back corner and read the legal journals. I would look up property law and land rights. I would study the history of our country. The librarians there knew me, and they were kind. They brought me tea and let me stay as long as I wanted. They didn't know why I was there every day, but they could see the sadness in my eyes. The isolation was the hardest part. At 67 years old, starting over is not easy. My friends from the neighborhood didn't visit. It was too far for them to drive, and they didn't like coming to this part of town. I felt like I had been erased from the world. I was just another elderly woman in a small apartment, invisible to the people passing by on the street. But every evening, when I walked back to my studio, I would stop and look at a small, leather-bound notebook I kept in my purse. In that notebook were the details of my father's property. I had the map of the access road. I had the location of the well. I had the dates and the deed numbers. I was waiting. I knew David and Tiffany were spending money. I could see their posts on social media. They were showing off their dream home. They were posting videos of the new gaming suite. They were buying expensive leather chairs and $4,000 computer systems. They were living the high life on the back of my 30 years of labor. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was just a broken old woman waiting for the end. They didn't realize that I was simply waiting for the right moment. I was waiting for them to be fully committed. I was waiting for them to have no money left in their bank accounts. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would look at the yellowed walls of my studio, and I would feel like giving up. I would feel like it was too much for someone my age. But then, I would remember the look on Tiffany's face when she called me an inconvenience. I would remember the way David wouldn't look me in the eye, and my resolve would harden like steel. I wasn't just fighting for a house, I was fighting for my dignity. I was fighting for the memory of my father and the 30 years of my life that they had tried to steal. They wanted a game? Well, they were about to find out that I knew the rules better than they did. They had the house, but I had the foundation. And very soon, I was going to remind them exactly what happens when you build your life on a foundation of lies. The tiny studio apartment was cold, and the radiator hissed like a tired snake. But I didn't mind the noise anymore. I had something else to focus on. In the corner of the room, sitting under a pile of old blankets, was a heavy wooden trunk. It had belonged to my father, George. He was a man of few words, a surveyor who spent his life measuring the hills and valleys of this county. He used to say that people come and go, but the land is the only thing that stays put. I sat on the floor, my knees popping with the effort, and pulled the trunk toward me. It smelled like cedar and old tobacco. I turned the key in the lock, and the lid creaked open. Inside were rolls of maps, old compasses, and a thick, leather-bound folder tied with a piece of twine. This was my inheritance. Not the gold or the stocks that some families leave behind, but something far more valuable. Knowledge. I pulled out the folder and began to spread the papers across the small kitchen table. Most of them were old tax receipts and utility records. But at the very bottom, I found what I was looking for. There were 2 distinct deeds, yellowed with age but still perfectly legible. I felt my heart begin to thud against my ribs as I read the descriptions. My father had been a very cautious man. In the 1950s, when he first bought the homestead, he did something that most people today would find strange. He deeded the house and the 1 acre it sat on as one parcel. But he kept the surrounding 4 acres, the private access road, and the site of the deep water well as a completely separate legal entity. I leaned back in my chair, a slow realization dawning on me. When David and Tiffany tricked me into signing that quitclaim deed, they had only focused on the house. They saw the colonial structure. They saw the master bedroom. They saw the kitchen. They had searched the records for the address of the house. And because they were so arrogant, because they thought they were smarter than an old librarian, they never looked at the property lines. The deed I had signed over to David only covered the 1 acre plot where the house stood. I, Martha, still held the exclusive, undisputed title to the land surrounding it. I owned the long gravel driveway that was the only way to get a car from the public road to the house, and most importantly, I owned the small plot of land where the well pump was located. That well was the only source of water for the entire property. There was no city water connection out there. If that pump stopped, the house would be nothing more than a very expensive, very dry box of wood. I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a landowner. In the state of Texas, and in much of America, property rights are sacred. If someone owns the land, they have the right to control who crosses it. They have the right to protect their resources. I took out my magnifying glass and traced the lines on the surveyor's map. Yes, it was all there. The access road was a private easement that my father had never turned over to the county. It was mine. Every pebble, every inch of dirt, every blade of grass on that road belonged to me. David and Tiffany had their gifted house. They had the walls and the roof. But they were essentially living on an island that was surrounded by my territory. They had stolen my home. But they had forgotten that a home cannot survive without the world around it. I spent the rest of the night writing notes in my journal. I didn't feel tired. I felt sharp. I felt like the daughter of George the surveyor again. I realized that my father had reached out from the past to give me the tools I needed to defend myself. He had known that someday I might need a foundation that couldn't be shaken. I looked out the window at the grey city alleyway, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel lonely. I felt like a woman who was about to go to work. I had the deeds. I had the maps, and I had the law on my side. David and Tiffany thought they had evicted me, but they were about to find out that they were the ones who were truly out of place. The temptation to call David right then and there was almost overwhelming. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I had found the papers. I wanted to see the look on Tiffany's face when she realized her empire was built on my dirt. But I stopped myself. I took a deep breath and remembered a lesson from one of my favorite history books. A battle is not won by the person who strikes first. It is won by the person who strikes at the perfect moment. I decided to play the long game. I decided to be silent. For the next 3 months, I stayed in my tiny studio apartment. I lived on canned soup and toast. I saved every penny of my social security and my small pension. I wanted to build a war chest. I knew that when the time came, I would need money for contractors and legal filings. I also started watching them. Not in person, but through the window they had opened to the world. Tiffany was constantly posting on her social media. She was so proud of her new gaming suite. I would sit in the library, using their high-speed internet, and watch her videos. She showed off the master bedroom. It was unrecognizable. They had torn out my floral wallpaper and painted everything a dark, matte grey. They had installed rows of neon purple and blue lights that moved to the beat of the music. She had a desk that cost more than my first car. She had 3 massive computer monitors and a chair that looked like it belonged in a spaceship. "We've invested over $50,000 into this studio," she told her viewers with a smug grin. "We've upgraded the wiring. We've put in soundproofing. We've turned this old, dusty house into a world-class streaming hub. It's all about growth, guys. It's all about leaving the past behind." $50,000. I wrote that number down in my notebook. $50,000 of their savings, money that should have gone toward a down payment on their own place, was now physically attached to the walls of my house. The more they spent, the deeper the trap became. Every new piece of equipment was another reason they couldn't afford to walk away. I saw David in the background of one of the videos. He looked stressed. He was carrying boxes of expensive electronics. He looked like a man who was working 2 jobs just to pay for Tiffany's dream. I felt a momentary pang of sadness for my son. But then I remembered the clipboard. I remembered the pen. I remembered the hospital bed. I waited. I waited while they held a grand launch party for her channel. I watched as they invited other streamers over, cars lining the long private driveway that I owned. I watched as they ordered expensive catering and held late-night parties. They were living as if they were kings of the hill. They truly believed that they had won. But I was busy too. I made a trip to the county clerk's office and filed a formal notice of revocation for the informal use of the private road. I didn't send it to David yet. I just made sure it was on the record. I also contacted a local fencing company. I told them, I needed a heavy, industrial-grade steel gate installed at the very edge of my property line, right where the private road met the county highway. The contractor asked me why I needed such a heavy gate for an empty plot of land. I just smiled at him and said that I was planning on storing some very valuable equipment there. It wasn't a lie. I was storing my dignity. I also spoke to a well technician. I asked him how to safely decommission a pump. He told me it was simple. You just pull the primary breaker and lock the control box. Since the well was on my separate parcel of land, I had every legal right to do so. Is there a backup well on that property? The technician asked. No, I replied. That is the only one. I went back to my studio and sat in the dark. I could feel the tension building in my chest. It was almost time. I had the money for the gate. I had the legal documents ready. I had the knowledge. The silence was my greatest weapon. David hadn't called me once in 3 months. Not even to see if I was alive. Not even to ask how I was doing in that run-down part of town. Their silence was born of guilt and arrogance. My silence was born of strategy. I looked at the calendar. Tiffany had announced a 24-hour charity stream for the following Saturday. She was expecting hundreds of visitors to her digital channel and dozens of deliveries of food and supplies to the house. It was going to be the biggest day of her career. Perfect, I whispered to the empty room. I realized then that respect is not something you can take from someone. It is something you earn. And it is something you defend. They had treated me like a piece of old furniture that could be tossed in the trash. They had treated my father's land like a playground. They wanted to live in a high-tech world? Well, I was about to bring them back to the Dark Ages. No road, no water, no escape. I closed my eyes and for the first time in months, I slept like a baby. I knew that when I woke up, the world was going to change. And this time, I was the one who held the pen. The morning of that Saturday was unusually quiet. I woke up in my small studio apartment before the sun had even touched the grey rooftops of the city. I felt a strange sense of calm. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I simply felt like a woman with a job to do. I made myself a cup of black coffee and looked at the calendar. Today was the day. Today was the day Tiffany would host her 24-hour charity livestream. She had been talking about it for weeks on social media. She called it the main event. I drove my old silver sedan out of the city and toward the countryside. As I got closer to the house, my house, I saw the familiar oak trees and the rolling hills. But things were different now. Bright banners were hanging near the entrance of the driveway. Signs were pointing toward the streaming suite. I parked my car on the public shoulder of the county road, well away from my property line. I didn't want them to see me. Not yet. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy industrial truck I had hired arrived. It was carrying a massive black steel gate. The workers didn't ask many questions. They just saw a woman with a legal deed and a checkbook. I watched as they began to dig the holes for the posts. They were working on the very edge of the gravel road, the private road that I owned. While they worked on the gate, I walked across the field toward the small, weathered shed that housed the well pump. This shed sat on the back corner of my 4-acre parcel. It was hidden by a thicket of pine trees. David and Tiffany probably hadn't even noticed it in the 2 years they lived there. To them, water was something that just came out of a tap. They didn't understand the machinery of the land. I opened the door to the shed. The air inside was cool and smelled like damp earth. I looked at the heavy iron breaker switch on the wall. This switch controlled the electricity to the pump that pulled water from 300 feet below the ground. Without this pump, the pipes in the colonial house would run dry in minutes. I reached out and gripped the cold metal handle. I thought about the 30 years of my life. I thought about the hospital bed. I thought about the word inconvenience. I pulled the handle down. The low hum of the pump stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I took a heavy padlock out of my pocket and snapped it onto the control box. Then, I walked back to the entrance of the property. The workers had finished installing the gate. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, strong, unyielding. It stretched across the entire width of the gravel road. I pulled the heavy steel doors shut and locked them with a thick iron chain. I looked at the house in the distance. It was a beautiful colonial home, but it was now a fortress with no gate. I sat in my car and watched. By noon, the chaos began. I saw a delivery truck from a local catering company pull up to the gate. The driver got out, looked at the locked steel bars and scratched his head. He tried to call the house, but he couldn't get through. 10 minutes later, a car filled with Tiffany's friends arrived. They honked their horns. They shouted. They took pictures of the gate with their phones. Then I saw the front door of the house fly open. Tiffany came running out. She was wearing a headset and a bright purple tracksuit. When she reached the gate, she began to scream at the catering driver. She was waving her arms, pointing at the house, demanding that he find a way in. But there was no other way in. The property was surrounded by thick woods and deep drainage ditches. My father had designed it that way for privacy. A few minutes later, David appeared. He looked confused. He was carrying a plastic water bottle. I watched as he tried to turn the handle of the gate, but the iron chain didn't budge. He looked around wildly, searching for an explanation. He looked toward the county road and saw my silver sedan. Our eyes met for a brief second. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just sat there, as still as a statue. David began to shout my name, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of the passing traffic. I saw him reach for his phone. My own phone began to buzz in my lap. I didn't answer it. I wanted the reality to sink in. I wanted them to feel the weight of the land. I watched as the catering truck gave up and drove away. I watched as the friends in the car turned around and left. The grand launch was turning into a disaster. And inside the house, the toilets wouldn't flush. The sinks wouldn't run. The expensive coffee machine wouldn't work. The high-tech gaming suite was becoming a hot, thirsty cage. I put my car in gear and drove away. I had done what I came to do. I had reclaimed the foundation. David and Tiffany had the roof, but I had the world. And without the world, the roof is nothing. The phone didn't stop ringing for 3 hours. David called me 34 times. Tiffany sent me a dozen text messages filled with words that would have made a sailor blush. They were panicking. The silence of the house and the dryness of the pipes were finally starting to break them. I sat in my quiet studio apartment, drinking a glass of cold water that I had paid for, and waited until the sun began to set. Finally, I picked up the phone. David's voice was a mixture of rage and desperation. He didn't even say hello. He just started screaming. "What are you doing, Mom? Have you lost your mind? There is a giant steel gate across our driveway. We have people waiting for the stream. We have no water. Tiffany is crying. Do you have any idea how much money we are losing every hour?" I waited for him to finish. I let the silence hang on the line for a long, uncomfortable moment. When I finally spoke, my voice was as calm and steady as a librarian reading a story to a child. "Hello, David," I said. "I assume you are calling about the road and the well." "Of course I'm calling about the road," he yelled. "Open the gate right now. This is illegal. You gave me this house. You can't just lock us out." "Actually, David," I replied, "I gave you the house. That is true. You have the deed to the structure. But if you look at the county records, the ones you and Tiffany were so sure you understood, you will see that the land and the road were never part of that gift. I am the sole owner of the 4 acres surrounding your house. And as the owner, I have decided to make a change." There was a muffled sound on the other end. I could hear Tiffany shouting in the background, demanding to know what I was saying. "What kind of change?" David asked, his voice trembling now. "It's just a business move, David," I said. I used the same tone he had used with me on that terrible Tuesday in November. "I have decided to lease the access road to a local construction firm. They need a place to store their heavy equipment and gravel. Since I no longer live on the property, the road is a wasted resource. Leasing it out is the smartest way to optimize my income." "You can't do that!" David screamed. "We can't get our cars out. We can't get groceries. We're trapped. Well, I said, that is a lifestyle challenge, isn't it? Perhaps you and Tiffany can find a way to optimize your way across the woods. As for the water, I've decided to decommission the well for a long-term environmental study. I'm a very grandmotherly woman, David. I've become very concerned about the groundwater levels lately. Since I don't need the water in my studio apartment, I've decided to shut the system down indefinitely. Mom, please! David's voice broke. He sounded like the little boy who used to cry when he fell off his bike. The viewers are waiting. Tiffany has a reputation to uphold. We spent $50,000 on this suite. We'll be ruined if we can't finish this stream. I understand, David, I said. But like you told me, we have to think about the future. My future involves a steady income from leasing my land. Your gaming suite is an inconvenience to my business model. I'm sure you understand. It's just a smart move. I heard Tiffany grab the phone. Her voice was like a jagged piece of glass. Listen to me, you old bat. Our lawyer is going to destroy you. We'll sue you for an easement. We'll have that gate torn down by Monday morning. I smiled. I actually smiled. You can certainly try, Tiffany. But an easement suit in this county takes at least 2 years to even reach a courtroom, and a retainer for a property lawyer will cost you at least $10,000. Do you have $10,000? Or did you spend it all on those neon lights and that fancy chair? The silence on the other end was absolute. They didn't have the money. I knew they didn't. I had watched their Amazon boxes for months. They had spent every penny on the empire that was now sitting in the dark with no running water. David, I said, my voice softening just a little, you told me that respect was the foundation of a home. You told me I was an inconvenience. You used my own eyes against me to steal my sanctuary. Now, you are learning what it feels like to have the foundation pulled out from under you. You have a house. Enjoy it. But remember, you are living on my land. And on my land, I make the rules. Mom, wait! David shouted. But I didn't wait. I hung up the phone. I felt a profound sense of peace. I wasn't being cruel. I was being just. I was providing them with a front row seat to the consequences of their own greed. They wanted to play a game. Well, the game was over. I went to my small bookshelf and pulled out a novel. I sat in my worn armchair and began to read. For the first time in 3 months, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman who had finally found her way home, even if that home was only 500 square feet. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle began. Or rather, the lack of a legal battle. David tried to find a lawyer, but no one would take the case without a massive upfront payment. The construction firm I had leased the road to was actually just a local friend who agreed to park a few old tractors there to make the lease look official. David and Tiffany couldn't stay in the house. Without water, the smell became unbearable within days. They had to leave their cars behind the gate and hike through the muddy woods just to get to a taxi. Tiffany's streaming career evaporated overnight. Her followers didn't want to hear about property disputes. They wanted games. And you can't play games when you can't even wash your face. The bank eventually came calling. David couldn't keep up with the property taxes and the legal fees. Without my financial help, and without Tiffany's income, the gifted house became a liability. I sat in my studio and watched the sunset. I knew that the end was coming. I knew that soon, the house would be empty again. I didn't want the house back. Not anymore. The memories had been stained. But I still had the land. And, as my father always said, the land is the only thing that stays put. Time has a way of smoothing out the rough edges of a broken heart. 1 year. It has been exactly 1 year since I sat in that dark studio apartment, counting my pennies and waiting for justice to take its course. Today, the air is sweet and carries the scent of blooming honeysuckle. I am sitting on the porch of my new home. It is a small, beautiful cottage nestled on a quiet piece of land just a few miles away from my old property. I was able to buy this place with the money I saved from leasing my access road to that construction firm. It turns out that a private road is a very valuable asset when people need a place to park heavy machinery. I also sold the rights to the deep water well to a local agricultural cooperative. They needed a reliable source for their cattle, and I was happy to provide it. The income from those two things, combined with my modest pension, allowed me to start over. Truly start over. I heard through the local grapevine what happened to my old colonial house. It was a tragedy of pride and poor planning. Without water and without a road, the house became a ghost. David and Tiffany tried to fight me in court, but they ran out of money before the first hearing. They had spent every cent of their savings on neon lights, expensive computers, and Tiffany's streaming equipment. When they couldn't pay the property taxes, and when the legal fees began to pile up like a winter snowstorm, the bank finally stepped in. They foreclosed on the house. The gift that David had stolen from me was taken away by a cold, faceless corporation. I heard that Tiffany left him the very day the sheriff posted the eviction notice on the front door. She didn't want a man who couldn't provide her with a stage for her digital life. She took the computer monitors, the expensive chair, and her cameras, and she moved on to find a new person to exploit. I was sipping a glass of lemonade, looking at the birds in my new garden, when I heard the sound of a tired engine. A beat-up, rusted truck pulled into my gravel driveway. It groaned and hissed as it came to a stop. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. It was David. But it wasn't the David I remembered. The man standing in front of me looked haggard. He was thin, and his clothes were stained and wrinkled. His hair was greasy, and his eyes, those eyes that used to be so bright and full of life, were now hollow and filled with a deep, crushing defeat. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of one. He walked toward my porch, his head hanging low. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up at me. "Mom," he whispered. His voice was cracked and shaking. I didn't stand up. I didn't scream. I just looked at him with a calm, steady gaze. "Hello, David," I said. "I lost it all, Mom," he said, and a tear began to roll down his dusty cheek. "Tiffany is gone. She took everything that wasn't bolted to the floor. I'm broke. I'm living in a wooden shack behind a warehouse where I work the night shift. It's cold, Mom. It's so cold." I thought back to the studio apartment he had forced me into. I thought about the smell of the dumpster outside my window. I thought about the 4 walls of loneliness he had given me as a lifestyle move. "I'm sorry to hear that, David," I said. And I truly meant it. It is a terrible thing to see your child suffer, even when they have brought that suffering upon themselves. "Please, Mom," he said, reaching out a trembling hand. "I see you have an extra room here. It's just me now. I won't be any trouble. I'll help with the yard. I'll do anything. Can I just come home?" The word home hung in the air between us. It was a beautiful word. But David had destroyed the foundation of that word a long time ago. He had treated home like a business. He had treated his mother like an inconvenience. I took a slow breath and looked at my beautiful, quiet cottage. "David," I said softly, "I've spent the last year making this place my own, and I've already decided what to do with that extra room. I've turned it into a reading nook. I've filled it with the books I saved from the library. It's my sanctuary." David's face fell. He looked like he was about to collapse. "It's a lifestyle move, David," I continued, using his own words with a gentle, firm precision. "I'm at a point in my life where I need peace and quiet. I think you will find that your shack is much more suited to your current character. It's important to live in a place that reflects who you are." "Mom, you can't be serious," he sobbed. "I'm your son." "You were my son when I was in that hospital bed," I replied. "You were my son when you handed me that pen. But you chose to be a stranger that day. And strangers don't live in my house." I stood up and walked to the door. I felt a profound sense of closure. The weight that had been on my chest for a year was finally gone. I realized that respect is the only thing that keeps a roof over your head. If you destroy that respect, you don't deserve the shelter. "I hope you find your way, David," I said. "I really do." I walked inside and closed the door. I heard the engine of his rusted truck groan as he started it up. I heard the gravel crunch as he backed out of my driveway. I went into my reading nook, sat in my favorite armchair, and opened a book. The house was quiet, but for the first time, in a very long time, it was the right kind of quiet. I was 68 years old, and I was finally, truly, at peace. I had learned that you cannot change the past, but you can certainly protect your future. David wanted a gaming suite, and he ended up with a front row seat to the consequences of his own greed. As for me, I have my books, I have my garden, and I have the land beneath my feet. And that is more than enough for any woman. As I sit here today in my quiet reading nook, surrounded by the books that have been my faithful companions for decades, I feel a profound sense of peace. My journey over the last few years has been difficult. It has been painful, and it has been filled with a betrayal I never thought possible from my own flesh and blood. But as I look out at my garden, I realize that every trial was a lesson in disguise. I learned that a roof over your head is not just made of shingles and wood. It is built on a foundation of respect, gratitude, and love. If you destroy that foundation with greed and lies, you simply do not deserve the shelter above your head. David wanted a high-tech gaming suite. He wanted neon lights and digital fame. In the end, he got exactly what he earned. He got a front row seat to the consequences of his own choices. He lost his home. He lost his wife. And he lost the trust of the one person who would have done anything for him. It is a hard truth. A very hard truth. But it is one that we must all remember. What goes around always comes around. You cannot build a beautiful life on the broken heart of your mother. You cannot take what is not yours and expect to keep it forever. Justice may be slow. It may take a year of waiting in a tiny studio apartment. But justice is inevitable. I want to thank you for spending your time with me today. It means so much to share these reflections with a community that understands the value of hard work and the importance of family. If you believe that respect is the most important part of any home, or if you believe in the power of poetic justice, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us share these important lessons with others who might be going through their own struggles. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel, Elderly Stories. We would love to have you join our family of listeners. Please leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had to stand your ground against someone you loved? Your stories of strength inspire us all. Before I go, I want to share a quick note with all of you. While this story was a fictional narrative created to be engaging and easy to follow, the message and the lessons it carries are very real. The values of integrity and the consequences of greed are truths that stay with us forever. Thank you for watching. May your day be filled with peace, your home be filled with respect, and your heart be filled with the strength to always do what is right. God bless you all, and I will see you in the next story.